Thank you so much. Thank you for your invitation, Byron, and it's so nice to be with you. I really love to build relationships, and I love Singapore. I was here in 2018 and did some qualitative study with interviews of some Pentecostal leaders, so I'll come back to that. But what I want to talk about is not to promote one model of Pentecostal leadership, because I think it's more complex than that. So you'll see that I'll talk about contextuality, complexity, and constructiveness, and I hopefully you won't fall asleep when I talk about that. But like I said, I don't think there's one model of Pentecostal leadership. It's rather, I think we need to include various aspects of it to make Pentecostal leadership both healthy and beneficial. Grant Wacker, an American historian of Christianity, he wrote about the Pentecostal story, and he made this quote. He said that Pentecostal history shows that strong, determined, clear-eyed leaders orchestrated the revival from the first to last. And I think leaders are important in it, but in one sense, innovative leaders are important for Pentecostal growth and expansion. And it's also Pentecostals has gained cultural influence and also political spheres in different aspects. Still, I think that leadership is a complex phenomenon. And I don't think we can just draw it down to one single concept. So what I will use as a definition is more that it is a social process that influences others towards a common goal. I think, like I said, leadership can be complex, and I'll use a terrible metaphor at the start here, because I think the church was born out of two mothers. Please don't leave the room because of the terrible metaphor. But in one sense, I mean, the church, it's from above. The church is given from God. It's made by God. But on the other side, we can also see it from a sociological model, because the church is also a sociological institution where it kind of comes from below, where church is shaped by humans and contexts. And I think we need to look at both these aspects. So, of course, the Bible should be important in Christian leadership, but I don't think the Bible presents one leadership model. So I think we need to draw on academic leadership studies as well as I will do, and I will draw on both aspects in my presentation. So what I will emphasize is kind of the interaction between leaders, followers, and spirituality, and the spiritual dimension connected to God. And what I really think, it's a constructive perspective in the leader-follower relations. So I think Pentecostal leadership, it's not just made from scratch, but it can draw on resources and spirituality within congregations. So I'll start with this one, contextuality, because the thing is that we adapt to culture, and we're also shaped by the culture we live in. Harvey Cox, he said that Pentecostalism is a religion made to travel, and Pentecostalism is maybe the denomination who has been most contextual around the world, both in global influence, but also in capacity to localize expressions of a universal message. And I will summarize it a bit with Alan Anderson here, that Pentecostalism has an ability to transpose itself into local cultures and religious effortlessly, because of its primary emphasis on the experience of the Spirit and the spiritual calling of leaders who do not have to be formally educated in theology. So, in one sense, there is a flexibility here in But it can include both benefits but also burdens in leadership when we meet different cultures, because context and cultures implicitly influence religious organizations and leadership. And one of the aspects that I will, because there are different aspects when it comes to cultural aspects of leadership, but one of the theories is called implicit leadership theories. And that says something about that follower attributions are culturally located and cognitive schemas that are shaping individuals to understand how we should understand leadership behaviors. And one of the aspects here is called that leadership is in the eye of the beholder. So it's connected to the culture, that each culture will, will look at different aspects of leadership. And one of the research that I will draw on is called the Globe Study. It was made in 2004. It was 7,000 leaders, 950 organizations in 62 countries. What I will compare here, because there are 10 distinct clusters around the world, and what I will emphasize is Confucian Asia, which is Singapore, Hong Kong, and China and other lands, but also Nordic Europe. And the reason why I do it, because I come from the Nordic Europe and now we are in Singapore. Norway wasn't part of these original studies, but it has been part of newer research. But if we compare these aspects of leadership, we can see, for instance, that in Confucian Asia, which includes Singapore, it is self-protective, team-oriented, and humane-oriented, while Nordic Europe is more charismatic, visionary, participative, diplomatic, and less human-oriented and self-protective. And another Norwegian researcher, Berit Sund, she also wrote that Singapore can place greater emphasis on power distance and collectivism, while in Norway, leadership style is more characterized by free rein, involvement, and consideration. So a typical Norwegian leader would not be very effective in Singapore. And if we look at Gert Hofstede, which is from Netherlands, he did his study of 100,000 people in 50 nations. But what's really interesting here, we can it's just to see some of the different levels. If you look at power distance, for instance, it's connected to members where members accept the power which is distributed unequally and given more to leaders. So if you look at the map on the top there to the left, you can see that Western has less power distance. So I had a student, for instance. He was a military captain, and he flew from Norway to Jordan, which is in the Middle East. And in the Middle East, that's where the highest power distance is. So he tried to be really nice, like he came from Norway. It didn't work at all. We can look at collectivism too. Look at individualism. Norway is so high when it comes to individualism, because that's people only look after themselves and maybe their family, but not much more people. But collectivism belong to in-groups, and there's a more exchange of loyalty. And then what is called motivation, achievement, and success. Some years back, it was called femininity and masculinity, and not connected to gender. What Gert Hofstede called masculinity was achievement and success, and femininity was caring for others and quality of life. And they're actually in Norway and Sweden made the best in femininity. But I have to say, Norway is not perfect. Yeah, I'll show you a picture of a book here, because Julien Borel, who's a French-Canadian, he moved to Norway and he's working at the university in Norway, but he saw that the culture was different. So look at this. These are Norwegians. They are happy, sad, and angry, and the smile is not like when they got drunk, they start to smile. That's typically you can see on a bus too. Children and drunk people can talk to you, but no one else talk to you. So I'm living 2 hours from Oslo, and I take the train. And one time I was sitting in, the train was full of people. And I put my suitcase on the shelf, and I opened a bottle of Coke. And suddenly the suitcase was falling from the shelf, just like that. And the Coke was like a volcano. It's just out in the whole room there. But no one talked, except for one guy who was so wet due to my soda. So that's typical Norwegian. And Berit Sund that I mentioned, she also said that she called it hell meeting. When you have meetings in organizations, everyone should raise their hand and say something. Because even if the people before you had told you, you should do that. So I mean, Norway isn't perfect, but different cultures are different. And another study, it's comparing USA and Singapore, or more general in Asia. One interesting thing here is that Americans on the A here describe leaders as standing in the front of the group. But what they saw in Singapore and Asia was that leaders are more standing behind the group, because they are prioritizing group responsibility over individual assertion and focus on group and interpersonal relationship, which can be good. And the conclusion in the article here is that culture colors the pictures we see when we imagine following the leader. So we need to contextualize leadership to meet the culture we are part of. But on the other side, we are also shaped by culture. And what I really think is that we need to keep also analytical and critical distance to the culture we are part of, especially when we think from a Christian perspective, because we can be dominated by the context more than the biblical text. And to use another word, discursive regimes, which means specific way of understanding and ordering human activity, it's often set the standard for leadership theory and the values and concern we have. And if I can share with you a personal story, I took on a church planting role, and I was burned out. And the thing is that, yeah, I'm pastoral, I'm relational, but I'm not a founder and entrepreneur. And I always said that I will not start a church. But that was kind of the dominant discourses in the Pentecostal movement. And it was not traditional power that someone pushed me into it. No. But it was more modern power that Michel Foucault, which I totally agree with his conclusions, but he's writing about discourses. He's talking more that culture and the setting we live in can shape us. So I took on the role and I was burned out. So it's not only my stories, but it's also discourses in culture. For instance, individualization is extremely strong in Norway. So one scholar, philosopher, he did a study in Church of Norway related to liturgy changes in the church. And what he said was that the typical question way back has been, who is God? But now the question has been, who am I? Even in a Christian setting. So I mean, cultures and discourses can shape us. So I think we need to, we can always be formed by subjective experiences and dominating paradigms. And I think just this study that I did with my colleague, when dominant models become dominating, that says, for instance, that implicit leadership theories can emphasize more masculinity than femininity. And we don't argue here out from a feminist perspective, but I mean, God is pouring His Spirit on all people. You can see that in Acts 2 and Joel 2. So there can also be female leaders. And Amos Young, he has this quote here that the powers of the present age, the conventions, traditions, and structures of this world are being undermined by the witness of those filled with the Spirit. So we really need to lift up the overarching biblical narrative and fleshing it out in the renewal of the world. And like Martin Hollenweger, one of the early Pentecostal scholars, he said that self-critical reflection is a mark of spirituality. And I think we need to do that. Of course, we should adopt and contextualize our message into the culture, but we should also take a step back to see maybe culture can shape us too much in the way we do it. All right, so that was contextuality, and now I talk about complexity. And I'll draw mostly on my PhD, my book here on the phenomenology of Pentecostal leadership. I will not emphasize all aspects here, but it's the first aspect was motivated by higher divine purpose. You know, most of the leaders that I interviewed, they sensed a calling to do that, and they wanted to serve God's plans and purposes for the congregation and the world. I'll be fast with the first here. And also derived leadership, that they lead on behalf of someone else. And they want to discern what God is saying and what God is doing, and making spiritual practices crucial to Pentecostal leadership. Still, this humane divine interaction, it's something that when you discern God's way and will, it's not reduced to simply listening and obeying. Because what these people saw, that it was both spirituality and rationality in their leadership. And if I go to the study I mentioned here, which is, it's written with Frank Marco, who did interviews in the US, and I did interviews in Singapore and in Norway. But what we saw here is there is an interaction between divine and human agency, because God is active in every aspect of life. And to make a quote here, the participants were neither monarchs nor mouthpieces. They sensed that they led on behalf of God and were thus not entirely free to pursue their own agenda. Yet they could not resign to apathy, since the outworking of divine initiative involved human agency. And what they really sensed in the leadership was both praying and planning. They do the both, because the divide, it's connected both to the spiritual but also to the material domain, and it's a work of the implications of divine initiative, where leaders relate to the Pentecostal tradition in diverse ways. And if I go back to the other aspect here, pragmatic stance toward tradition. So many of the interviews I did with Pentecostal leaders, they saw this tradition both as a resource, but also as a source. It was, in one sense, they were defined by the Pentecostal tradition, but in another sense, they also defined it. They had place to set direction for the congregation and define its reality. So in one sense, if we can see it as an arrow, the plasticity of Pentecostalism is open for leaders to be innovative and pioneering. And here the tradition can be seen as a resource and a source, like I said, and a lot of opportunities for Pentecostal leaders and congregation. But on the other perspective, they can also be seamless and borderless, where they can have a pragmatic tendency that can make their leadership on a two-edged sword, to come with a sight here. On one side, it fosters innovation by freeing leaders to actively choose the form and methods that are best suited to serve the overall purpose of the church in the time and place they exist. On the other side, the freedom from binding traditions may end up as a slippery slope of uncritical utilitarian emphasis on visible access. So I mean, this is part of the complexity here, and I'll just, I have short time, so I'll jump over some of the aspects here. But I'll go back to this one, the dialectic relationship between structure and agency. Well, leaders, they can both change the organization, but they can also adapt to the organization. And what I saw in one of the interviews I did was that, the leader can be an agent, he can impact the organization, but also the structure can also impact the leader. And one of the guys I interviewed, he had been a really successful leader in one part of Norway. And then he was invited to move to another church, a bigger church. And when he comes there, he didn't have much space to be a leader. And that's sort of the complexity that can happen in leadership too. Because, we can, as leaders, we can influence the organization, but we can also be influenced by the organization. And the leaders can break with congregants, and that will often weaken their leadership. So, the structure and agency are very much interconnected. Going back to that research again in Singapore, Norway, and the US. And we had a model in this article, and derived leadership, it's about setting direction and surrendering to God, spirituality as core. It means that both the leader and others are connected to God, right? And that's something we need to draw into leadership, I think. And sense-making I'll talk more about later. But, the spirituality as core for the leaders are also connected to followers. And then we have what we saw, an ambivalence and tension. Because some of them experienced that the leaders was more autocratic than democratic. Some saw that there was an ambivalent Pentecostal tradition and structure and agency that I just talked about. And I think that God needs to speak more than to leaders through the Spirit. I have written several books in Norway, and one of them is called God in Church Asylum. And the reason for that was that immigrants in Norway that should be sent out of the country, they can actually go to the church and their police wouldn't pick them out from there. But the problem was that we typically put God in church asylum too. Because my argument in that book was that we need to communicate, to be relevant, to contextualize in the community. So I'm preaching about that in a church in the city where I live, and then the pastor comes up and he says, "Yeah, that's really good, but don't you think that we need an outpouring of the Spirit too?" That was terrible for a Pentecostal leader. But what happened just a few months later was that God put in a cartoon in Norway's largest newspaper. Look at this. The moment when Truls realizes he has forgotten the most important thing. I didn't make this. This was in the biggest newspaper in Norway. So what is this? The sail isn't up. God is blowing his wind. We need to get up the sail. And I think we need that in leadership too, to really connect both leaders and followers to the work of the Spirit. Because there can be a latent tension because in Pentecostal setting it's an open egalitarianism, that all members have access to the Holy Spirit. On the other side, we have authoritarian leaders that should also take their role in hierarchy. But how should we handle that? I think God pours out the Spirit on all people, so we need to give gifts to all believers for the advantage of the church. And I don't think that we have to be democratic in all aspects of leadership. But I think leaders should have an influential role, but it should be connected to ethical reflection and not only enforced submission. And Simon Chan, who is a Singaporean theologian, I think he'll be here tomorrow. I met him in 2018, but he has a really good quote: critical self-reflection is essential when a movement matures. I think that's good. We need the critical reflection. So if one thinks that Pentecostal leaders are alone elected by God, there can easily be an abuse of power. And we've seen that in Norway, actually, in Pentecostal fellowship in Norway. Some sense that you have to be, if you're loyalty to God, you need to be loyalty to the leader. And when members exposed vulnerability and expressed their personal values, they were seen as threats to the primary mission of the church. And the influence felt powerless and borderless, and saw God's will as destructive through the communication of leaders. So I mean, we need to, I know I'm talking about complexity here, but we need to, because God is calling someone to leaders, but He's also sending His Spirit to all people, so we need some kind of relationships that I will talk more about here. Yep, I'll talk about constructiveness, because complexity, I mean, it doesn't need to undermine leadership at all, because leaders are important in ecclesial organization. And I'm quoting David Martin here, a British professor in religious studies. He says that given explosive energies unleashed by the Pentecostal Spirit, only resourceful and decisive leadership can prevent fragmentation and loss a sense of direction. So leaders are important, but we look at the story. Some have been heartful and some have been hurtful. And we need to be constructive between leaders and followers. And some use this as a reversal of the lens, where we can see followers as agents and also created effective followership and the leadership outcomes. And one of the model is from Boaz Shamir, was an Israel leadership scholar. He was talking about a leadership co-production model, that both leaders and followers are connected in relationship. And I don't think there is one theory for this. There are different theories we can draw on, but still there is an emphasis on both leaders and followers. And I think that is especially relevant in a Christian setting, because leaders and followers are joined to the spiritual dimension and connected to God. So go back to Simon Chan again. In his book, he said that the popular notions of leadership centering around the leader with a vision often reduce the rest of the community to passive followers, and also subvert the biblical concept of the church. And he said that leaders should make explicit what is implicit among its members and theologize from and for the community of faith. And Frank Macchia, who has been here several times, he writes in one of his articles that Pentecostal theology emphasizes the importance of a gifted congregation rather than focusing solely on anointed individual. So I think we need both, but we shouldn't just emphasize the one leader. So relations are important due to the Spirit on all people. And Darrell Guder, he's an American-German theologian, he says that the engagement and connection between people in churches is understood through a relational lens, where leadership is seen as relational, which is taking place in networks and relationships, and demonstrate God's love through the way of relationship work. And one aspect here is actually humility. This has been very important in theology and philosophy, but it's also been drawn down into organizational leadership for the couple of last decades. And some American scholars, they see it as an interpersonal trait that can, is a willingness to view oneself accurately as a leader, as an humble leader, to appreciation of others' strengths and contribution, and teachability and openness to new ideas and feedback. So humility can avoid excessive self-focus and also enable leaders to gain self-awareness and build perspectives through relationship with followers. And one of the quotes here is that self-views are focused on their interdependence with others rather than their independence from others. I think that is really good, that interdependence with others would be a good part of leadership. And just to show a study from Central Europe too, here you can see that when leader acts humble in social exchange with followers, they develop positive relationship and also increase emotional trust. So that's one aspect. Another aspect I think we can look at when it is Christian leadership, that is actually friendship. And a Norwegian scholar who is also a friend, he did a study in the Lutheran churches in Norway, and he said that members highlight trust, loyalty, and the friendship-like relationship with the leader as an ideal. And you can see the same in Chloe Lynch, if you have read her. Is a British scholar who wrote a book on ecclesial leadership as friendship. And she's lifting up the obedience, which is freely chosen and rooted in knowledge and love. And she referred actually to John 15, where Jesus is talking that love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. This is my command, love each other. And another aspect here is also, I'm sorry, I'm running through things to spend my time, but it's also, when I was a pastor, what I tried to lift up all the time was not only to connect to me as a leader, but to connect to the theodrama, the biblical narrative. And Ira Shalaf, who was a research follower, research scholar, he used this, both leaders and followers are connected to a common purpose. And I think as long as the leader are working for the common purpose, we should support the leader. But if the leader is drawing back from them or going other directions, well, then we should connect to the central goal of the organization, but challenge him or her if the purpose is threatened, and take a moral position that is unlike from the leader if it's necessary to prevent ethical abuse. So in some of this, I think that looking from leadership ethics, the best leadership implies a process of inclusive and sharing leadership rather than coercion and manipulation between leaders and followers. All right, so then I'll look at the conclusion here. If I try to summarize, I think even Christian organizations, they are theological, but they are also sociological. And that's why we need to draw on leadership studies. Of course, theological perspectives are most important, but they can also be shaped by the context we live in. So ecclesial leadership can be integrated into various disciplines. I will not spend, of course, I could have talked about different models here. For instance, servant leadership that I think is very relevant for the Christian church, but I haven't spent much time on that. But I have more emphasis on relational leadership and friendship. And I think, in Pentecostal leadership, in one sense, Pentecostals promote indigenous leadership and emphasis that the Spirit's work in and through all believers. So God's people minimize the division between clergy and laity, which is connected to spirituality, of course. But from the other side, leaders can also be celebrated and elevated with high levels of power and prestige. And especially from research in Africa, you have seen that leaders can be more elevated than Christ and replace the gospel and threatening people in their lives. So what I think is, as we need as Pentecostal leaders, it is to address identity of ourselves, but also for the church, and reflexivity, to avoid toxic and abusive leadership. And I'll have the last quote here. In sum, Pentecostal leaders must listen to the Spirit, discern their time and context, and attend to the people they lead in the congregation. This implies that leadership is contextual and complex, but also constructive, as it sets direction for the church and helps the local members to learn the script and understand how it should be performed in the present cultural scene. So we are not authors, but we are directors, right? God has written the grand story that we should take part of. But as leaders, we can be directors that help people to live it out. So I think if Pentecostal leadership should be sustainable, then the influence of the congregation must be granted and not grabbed. Can I pray? Oh, let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much for, and I pray that you help us, both as leaders, as followers, to discern your will and to be faithful to your will and live out the biblical narrative, both as leaders and followers. And fill us with the Spirit. Help us to put up the sail and change people and the world we live in. Amen.
Thank you, Truls.
Should I sit?
Thank you. Go ahead.
What a presentation it was. First of all, I'm not going to follow the brilliant example of Pastor Bobby. I'm not going to summarize because you have the full text, and there's no way that I can summarize as brilliantly as he did. But instead, I'm going to engage with my friends. So I think with that permission, all right, it works. I'm so glad that my friend also introduced the 8 characteristics of Pentecostal leadership that he published. He's a Scandinavian Pentecostal scholar on leadership and theology. And earlier, you may remember 2 years ago, my presentation deeply engaged with him. So this is the second time I'm doing it. And of course, my presentation was published in the book. Now, he presented these 3 C's: contextuality, complexity, and constructiveness. I don't know if he will have 5 more C's to complete it, but I found it very helpful. I'm engaging with him as a conversation partner, as a learner of his leadership theoretical expertise, and his continuing exploration of Pentecostal leadership, both from his Scandinavian context and expanding to global context. And particularly he's coming from sociological, especially the social science perspective, which I deeply appreciate. So I come as a theologian. I do not know much of social science. Therefore, I'm not a leadership expert, but also coming from a different context. I'm a biblical scholar, Old Testament, coming as an Asian, but also my title currently is a professor of global Christianity. So I definitely live with a global context. Potentially, I see that the social science expertise and perspective and my theological approach can complement each other, and it shows that we need everybody, right? So I'm going to follow his 3 C's as I engage with him. Contextuality, I will just cherry picking. I'm not going to go all over his presentation. It is very obvious that in the shaping of effective leadership is expectation and even acceptance by the followers. The contextual sensitivity and relevance is critical. And the Pentecostal leadership is also shaped by spiritual and theological context, as stressed by our friend. And also how the church is organized, especially because the presentation assumes positioning the leadership within the local church setting. So we cannot simply assume that Pentecostal churches are organized and operated in the same way all over the world. It is not the case. Also, his good advice, balancing between spirituality and rationality. This is something we definitely need to explore more. So I'm going to take just two samples of Asian context to dialogue with his presentation. The first one, I think Veli-Matti's presentation was very helpful. The religions, and especially religious leadership. We know that there's a presence of myriads of organized and unorganized religions in Asia. Christianity is a small minority, only 8.2% in 2020 in Asia. So you can imagine that many Christians moved over from their previous religious life. So naturally, we can expect that they also bring their religious expectations, including leadership. How they treated, viewed, perceived the previous religious leadership is also influencing how they understand the Christian leadership. So by and large, religious leadership is a divine intermediary. And oftentimes, the power distance is very wide. Because oftentimes, friendly shaman, you cannot find one. Because always their speech will be rebuking and almost the tone changes, right? It's not friendly at all. I mean, that's by design. But also the power distance is further widened by the claim of supernatural power. If the shaman is able to effectively bring the spirit of the deceased member of the family to be able to speak with a living member, just imagine, that will command not only reverence but also fear. And that is the reality of the power distance. And the claim of supernatural power includes also the Pentecostalism. So we come with a great gift, but also responsibility to be a faithful steward. Therefore, we have seen very unfortunately there are cases of unaccountable Pentecostal leaders turning to be a risk to an organization or liability. He suggests the friendship model, and we immediately respond from Asia, that's not going to work here. I don't think, for example, even if Dr. David Yonggi Cho has all the sincerity to become a friend to everybody, people will not perceive in that way. Because leadership is not only made, but also is perceived. In that area, Dr. Åkerlund had a very good perception. So the leadership is to operate in the context, but also it is to transform the cultural context. So there is a dual calling here. So the other one is a socio-cultural norms of Asia. Again, Asia is not just one reality. even as Confucian-oriented societies. Singapore will be very different from Japan, Taiwan, Korea, despite the same cultural framework. I just enjoyed Dr. Yonggi Cho's candid presentation of his own struggle when he was going through a serious health struggle. The Lord revealed that you are not the only one who will do the ministry. I have sent you so many people. And he was arguing, no, they are my sheep. No, they are to be your co-workers. And you are to eventually grow them to be leaders. And he said, no, it's not going to work in that way. You have called me to be shepherd to all these people. And God said, no. So Cho had to be confronted in two particular areas. His framework of clergy and laity relationship, it is almost like fixed, permanent leadership versus followership. And God was saying, no, it doesn't work in that way. And second one is, again, it's a gender norm. Especially in the 70s in Korea, a decent man is not going to sit down under the teaching of a woman. It will never happen. So Cho had to overcome it. You know, at the end, God wins. We all know that. But that doesn't happen overnight. He had to convince and educate his whole congregation. And the people said, we hired you and we are paying your salary so that you can lead us. No, God has called all of you to do ministry. So he was going through this, and now the rest is the history. The cell group system has revolutionized the Christianity and the Pentecostal movement. The complexity section, and as well as the constructiveness section, the greatest take I gained was his emphasis on followership. Oftentimes, leadership study focuses on leaders because it's called leadership study. But he simply said there's no leader without followers. So a healthy leader-follower relationship will mutually strengthen each other and ultimately build the faith community. So it is a very refreshing. But also, again, coming from not only Asia, but from the biblical perspective, I'd like to suggest the number of two particular components. One is, he rightly did, because leadership is based on God's call. But if we bring God into this leader-follower dynamic, that will eventually make the leader also a follower. So in this dynamic, in fact, the effective leadership is demonstrating how faithfully you are functioning as a follower to God. So that will turn the table slowly, because in that way, the leader is also a fellow follower. The other one is this, especially in the Pentecostal theology, a follower is also a spirit-empowered leader. In a local church setting, yes, members, followers are also called to be leaders. Just the leader is called spirit-empowered and sent, so is everyone in the congregation. Spirit-empowered nurses during the COVID era, there were the chaplains, there were the evangelists, and there were the pastors. And in fact, the work of the ministry is to empower them and prepare them to do this leadership work. Therefore, the leader of the church can treat and prepare the followers as fellow leaders in God's economy. So, the last, the constructiveness. There's nothing but to say big amen. The goal is transforming lives and communities, leading reconciliation with God and one another, and empowering followers to become Spirit-empowered leaders. What's the best way other than reading the scripture? Ephesians 4:11 through 13. I modified a little bit. Christ gave the leaders, apostles, prophets, evangelists, to equip his people for work of service, leadership, so that the body of Christ may be built up, telos, until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. That is a Spirit-filled and Spirit-empowered leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wansuk. That was so wonderful. And you're talking about culture. I really think we need to learn from each other. I was talking to a Norwegian. He's leading Christian magazine in Norway, and for me, it's been important across different denominations that we need to learn from each other. So I said that we are three with different branches, and we can learn from each other. But then he said that if one branch has a disease, it can be healed from another place. And I think we can draw this on when it comes to context too, because the cultural aspects that you had, I think it's really important. I think, I'm not thinking that I come from Europe and I tell you what to do. I think we can just try to open in a way so we can understand each other better, we can learn from each other, and try to connect the Christian message, maybe see it from another perspective than what is dominating in the perspective we are. So I think it was really, really good to listen to you. And also about adding God, that followers also can be leaders. I think that was extremely nice. See leaders as followers. So much good. So that's typical me. I want to reflect on things more than just talk of it. So I think it was really, really good what you said there. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Truls, for your interesting perspectives on leadership. My name is Wayne. I hold a sociology PhD from NTU, and I'm currently pursuing another master's in arts of leadership studies from Vanguard. I guess my question is, could you elaborate a little bit more on how you think Pentecostal leaders can take practical steps to move away from a leader-centered model? And what tangible ways can we create, as you said in your paper, a more co-constructive environment that empowers members to share their gifts, hold their leaders accountable, all this while still honoring the God-given gift of leadership?
Yeah. Wow. The question, I want to sit and reflect on it, but I think what we really need in leadership is critical self-reflection. I told you briefly about my own journey, about traditional and modern power, and there was an article that I use in a school that I'm teaching, and it's to Danish psychologists, organizational psychologists. They said that organizational and societal discourses that are normative in the sense that they present norms and standards for how we should be and what we should achieve, that can be really bad. So, and do you know if Merrill Westphal, which is an American philosopher, he wrote a book called Suspicion and Faith. And what he really drew on there was actually Freud and Marx and Nietzsche. And they are all not Christians at all. But his perspective was that they can challenge the motives and functions behind religious beliefs, and their critique of opportunity can be deeper reflection and self-examination. So he says that suspicion might be a kind of spirituality. And I think too that another aspect for me that has been extremely important as a Pentecostal leader is also the aspect of confession and relating to people. Stanley and Clinton, they wrote a book called Connection in the US. They're talking about upward mentoring. We should have older, maybe, yeah, I make jokes about having a crush on older men, but I look for people who are 25 years older than me that has been living in this sense of leadership for so much longer. That gives me perspective. And they talk also about downward mentoring, that we mentor people, but then they talk about peer. And for me, it's been extremely important that I have another Pentecostal leader that I live open with. So we talk with each other for usually 1 week, and one time in a month we ask questions coming out from you know, the I forgot the Methodist Church, where we really ask each other critical questions about sin and all, because I can confess and live open. So I think that's, when it comes to individual, I think that's definitely an aspect of leadership that is really important to stay in it for years. Maybe it was not a question, but I'm more a politician, right? So I don't answer.
You want another one?
Yeah.
Yeah, someone else.
Hi, Dr. Truls. My name is Dave. I'm a pastor from Malaysia and currently taking Master of Arts in Theology. So in recent years, we have seen prominent Pentecostal leaders fall or be removed from ministry due to burnout, abuse, or moral failure. In light of this and drawing from your expertise, how can we leaders stay on course and lead with integrity for the long haul?
Yeah, well, I talked about that in a lot of the last question, but I think if we can try to connect both relational leadership and performance expectations that can be a part of leadership, I think relational leadership is really connected to people, while performance expectations are more focusing on outcomes. And I think it's important that leaders not only misuse people, but they can use humility, like I talked about, as an important aspect of also in megachurches. Because if we can avoid the excessive self-focus, enable leaders to be self-awareness, I think it can build perspectives with relationships with followers. Well, I had a quote about that self-use are focused on their interdependence with others rather than the independence from others. And I think this interdependence is really important in Pentecostal settings. And leader humility can also put followers at the foreground and make hierarchies dynamic by encourage sharing of information and responsibility, but also enable community of collective discernment and truth and direction. So, well, there's a lot of complexity here, but yeah, I think relations and trying also to take a step back and reflect on what you do is really important. Yeah, we could try. Yeah, we could try.
One more.
Hello, Dr. Truls. I'm Serena, and I'm pursuing a Master's of Arts degree in SOT. I deeply appreciated the insights in your presentation. Now, much of the Far East is shaped by Confucianist values, which can be hierarchical and authoritarian. Yet they also promote respect, filial piety, moral integrity, and humility. In what ways can Pentecostal leaders thoughtfully engage these cultural values as leadership resources without replicating authoritarian patterns?
Man, that's a big question. Well, I think Pentecostal leadership in one setting that we have both been talked about that is applied to different settings. Still, if I look at the study that Marco and I did, we saw that there was several aspects across Singapore, US, and Norway: derived leadership, spirituality as core, divine and human agency, and also sense-making leadership. But the ambivalence and tension, that could maybe connect more to different culture. So I will not criticize the Confucian culture at all, because I think, for instance, that collectivism that you have can be really, really good. And where I come from, where individualism is really high, that's a problem in Christianity too. And the Globe study, they show that the Confucian Asia, including Singapore's high scores on performance orientation, institutional collectivism, and in-group collectivism, and other aspects too. So I think collectivism in one sense can be better than individualism, but it should still be open for individuals to travel their own road with the Lord, because we all are in different aspects, we have different callings, so there should be some space to really live out the calling. But what I all think we need to do is we need to try to adapt to the culture, but also break with the context if it's against the biblical narrative. And here it's, again, I'm talking about the same, but reflexivity, I think it's extremely important. And like I said earlier, I think we need each other. I think it's a good thing to talk to each other, because then we can learn more from how we should deal with it.